If I could, please, I'd like to introduce this event with a little bit of history. In 1974, at a small experimental educational field station in Elbert County, Colorado, a group of mostly grad students sat around a gigantic map of the Front Range of Colorado. And they were inputting information, watersheds, ecological zones, transportation corridors, energy resources, agricultural resources, suburban and urbanization patterns, more or less a McCarthyan study going on. And this was all being done under the watchful eyes of a multidisciplinary team of professors. Elizabeth Ingram, the director of that remarkable educational experiment, said something to us at the time that was had a profound impact on me. She said, you know, you're likely to see this corridor become a continuous suburban metropolis from Pueblo in the south to Fort Collins in the north. Elizabeth, in her know-it-all way, you know, oh my God, this is all in transition, you don't know what you're going to see, and it really had a big impact on all of us. And it was, for me, the first time I really thought of land as a larger idea of land as a system, not just as landscapes, which I'd grown up with and I loved profoundly, but the idea of land as a system on which other large systems interact. The population of Colorado, driven largely by Front Range growth, has exploded. In 1974, when we were sitting around that map, it was about 2.2 million people. It is now about 5.4 million people. That growth has been largely along the Front Range corridor. That growth is along a relatively narrow zone, a sweet spot of life where the plains are just high enough that they get about 18 inches of rain a year. It's completely different than if you get 100 miles out from the mountains where you're really in dryland farming, dryland agriculture. That 30-mile zone between the toe of the mountains and the drainages out on the plains supported a mixed grass prairie, a really glorious, beautiful mixed grass prairie that Elizabeth Ingram worked hard to educate us about the value of. That's hard in Colorado, where there are these mountain landscapes that everyone pays attention to try to get you to see the subtleties of the grasslands, the plains out there, kind of the black sheep of the landscape family in Colorado. But this mat of ancient life was basically stripped. Replaced by structures, lightweight structures built of rather insubstantial materials, infrastructure intensive developments, road intensive, water distribution system intensive, settlement patterns that are on a per capita basis may be the most consumptive settlement patterns on the planet Earth. Also socially, they're complex. We know all of this. I know all of you that study this know all of this, but it's helpful just to recap this. Socially complex in that the tax base is limited for the amount of infrastructure maintenance that they have, and we also are now seeing that they're socially problematic with the default rates and the rapidly changing income demographics in these suburbs. These professors from their many disciplines taught us that this grasslands was an incredibly complex ecosystem. It was a landscape that at once retained moisture, regulated temperature, was drought tolerant, supported species across all kingdoms of life, and had just really literally, and those of you who pay attention to soil know that this is actually true, like literally uncountable species of biota and mycorrhizal fungi that are working in a complex symbiotic relationship that we're just beginning to get a handle on. We also, in the stripping of this prairie, deprived ourselves of large-scale herbivores that maintained this prairie. I would also say large-scale herbivores that provided us with a reasonable source of animal protein that was produced in a sustainable and healthy way, which actually existed until relatively recently in Colorado. But even the Front Range cattle operations that had stepped in for where the buffalo and the antelope used to graze have now mostly moved on. So the suburbs are often discussed in this context of environmental degradation. But beyond species and habitat loss and resource consumption, there are other issues which relate to us here today. What those professors did not discuss 40 years ago is that when you was the potential of those grasslands to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the soil. This was a relatively new idea back then. There was no discussion of climate change 40 years ago, and these were all accomplished biologists and ecologists. We have since learned that those grasses, that complex web of grasses, has photosynthetic energy levels that can compete with forests. They are pulling the CO2 out of the atmosphere and tucking it down into the soil. When that photosynthetic machine is turned off, that carbon finds its way back into the atmosphere. Many in the scientific community, probably some of those that are here with us today, are now suggesting that this liberation of carbon from the soil is perhaps 50% of our carbon dioxide problem in the atmosphere. So suddenly, that whole equation has changed dramatically from even 10 years ago. I mean, there were certainly those that were on the cutting edge that were arguing this, but for the most part, it was fossil fuel emissions that was the problem. And conversely, those same scientists are telling us that perhaps one of the best ways of tackling this CO2 problem is to develop strategies for perennial landscapes that pull that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere back into the soil as a sequestration technique, a tried and tested sequestration technique that's been working for millions of years. So half this story is how we design our settlements, our transportation, our manufacturing. Another half might be how we work to get that carbon back into the soil and what our strategies are for land use. So this suburb that I've shown up here was seen as progress at the time. This is a relatively high-density suburb just outside of Denver, near Aurora. You see that they preserved some of the drainage areas there. The argument being that this was better than the sort of quarter-acre lots that were the post-war development in Colorado. But nonetheless, this is an impervious landscape. It's prone to heavy runoff events. It's right up against the natural gas industry developments in the Platte River play there, and a lot of it is beginning to change rapidly in terms of the economic viability of it. All right, so I better close this slightly long-winded introduction. The lessons for me of this little Front Range story serve a couple of purposes. A reminder that changes are taking place very fast. So 40 years ago, a blink of the eye historically, we didn't even have this carbon question on the table in the scientific community. And the way we're discussing carbon change and carbon sequestration is changing very rapidly too. I mean, a few years ago, there were all of these industrial methods and all of that were being touted, so we should be very careful. That brings me to the other thing, is that we should always remind ourselves of the precautionary principle, and we shouldn't rush into these big solutions too quickly. That we remind ourselves that wherever possible, we should seek to learn from nature, and that we should seek to protect existing systems until we know better. I think I better stop right there and hand it over to Rosalie. Again, welcome all of you. I'm thrilled that we're having this program in Cooper today, and we'll get